The sun rose over the cotton fields the same way it always did, slow and indifferent, spilling pale gold across rows of white bowls that stretched to the horizon like an ocean frozen in time. To the men who owned the land, it was a sight of promise, of profit, of order. To those who labored in it, it was a warning that another day of pain had begun, another day where the earth would drink sweat, tears, and sometimes blood. Ezekiel Freeman woke before the horn sounded Elway's deed. He lay on the dirt floor of the slave quarters, listening to the breathing of dozens of bodies packed together like cargo in a ship's hold. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed skin, damp wood, and old fear. He rose quietly, careful not to wake his mother, Ruth, who slept beside him. Her face was marked by lines carved there by years of labor and loss. She had been born on this plantation, and she would die on it, unless God or the devil intervened. Ezekiel had been born here too, but something inside him rebelled against the idea that this soil would claim him forever. Outside, the sky shifted from black to a bruised purple. Beyond the crude wooden quarters rose the big house, white and proud, its columns catching the first hints of dawn. Ezekiel hated that house with a quiet intensity that burned deeper every year. The horn sounded at last, a long, harsh blast that cut through the morning like a blade. Bodies stirred, groans filled the quarters as men and women pulled themselves up, bones stiff, muscles screaming. Ezekiel stepped into the field, a sack slung over his shoulder. The cotton plants stood shoulder high, their branches rough and unforgiving. He bent and began to pick, fingers moving with practiced speed. Pull, twist, drop. The sack grew heavier, the strap biting into his shoulder. The overseer, a man named Thomas Granger, rode along the rows on horseback, his whip carried like a badge of office. He watched with the bored vigilance of a man inspecting livestock. Any sign of slowness, any hint of defiance, and the whip sang. Ezekiel kept his head down. He had learned that eyes could betray you. By midday, the sun burned high and merciless. Sweat soaked Ezekiel's shirt and ran into his eyes. His fingers were raw. It was near the far end of the field when it happened. A boy named Samuel stumbled, his sack spilling cotton onto the dirt. He was no more than 14. His legs too weak for the weight he was forced to carry. He froze, eyes wide with terror. Granger saw it immediately. He rode over slowly, savoring the moment. The field seemed to hold its breath. Granger dismounted. "Careless," he said, his voice calm, almost pleasant. Samuel shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean." The whip cracked before he could finish. It struck Samuel across the back, tearing fabric and skin. The boy screamed, a sound so sharp it seemed to pierce the sky. Granger lashed him again and again, each strike deliberate. The cotton around them absorbed drops of blood, turning white to pink, then red. Ezekiel's hands trembled. He kept picking, forced his fingers to move, but every scream carved itself into his mind. When it was over, Samuel lay on the ground, sobbing. Two older men dragged him toward the shade, where he would be left to recover or die. No doctor would come. Slaves healed, or they didn't. That night, the quarters were heavy with silence. Ezekiel sat beside his mother. "There has to be more than this," he said. She met his gaze, her eyes dark and tired. "There is," she said, "but it ain't here." Later, Ezekiel slipped outside. The moon hung low over the fields, casting silver shadows across the cotton. And he dead hair, he needed space to think. A twig snapped behind him. It was Isaiah, an older man with a scarred face. "You shouldn't be out here," Isaiah said quietly. "Neither should you," Ezekiel replied. "You saw what happened to the boy," Ezekiel said. Isaiah nodded. "I see things like that every day." "Doesn't it make you want to do something?" Ezekiel asked. Isaiah studied him. "It makes me want to live." Ezekiel clenched his fists. "Living like this ain't living." Isaiah stepped closer. "Careful, boy. Words like that get men killed." "Maybe," Ezekiel said. "But keeping quiet gets us killed too. Just slower." Isaiah's eyes flicked toward the quarters, then back to the fields. "You got fire in you," he said. "Fire can warm you, or it can burn everything down. Question is, what you plan to do with it." The days blurred together after that. Work, pain, exhaustion. But something had shifted inside Ezekiel. He watched more closely now. He listened. He noticed how the overseers changed shifts, how the patrols moved, where the dogs were kept. At night, Isaiah began to talk more. Quiet conversations in shadows. He spoke of other plantations, of uprisings, crushed but not forgotten. He spoke of the North, of places where chains did not define a man's worth. The plantation owner, Colonel William Harrow, arrived one afternoon. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair and cold eyes. He spoke to Granger about the need for discipline. "Too much softness spoils them," Harrow said loudly, making sure everyone heard. "They need to remember what they are." Ezekiel felt something snap. What they are. That night, a woman named Lillian was dragged from the quarters. Her screams echoed across the fields, cut short by laughter. The next morning, she was gone. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the cotton, staring at the spot where Samuel's blood had soaked in. The stain was gone, washed away by sun and dust, but he could still see it. Blood on the cotton fields, blood that fed the wealth of men who would never soil their hands. He picked up his sack and stepped forward, but his path felt different now, heavier with purpose. The chains were still there, real and unyielding. But so was something else, something growing in the shadows, waiting. This land had been watered with suffering for too long, and sooner or later it would demand payment. The season turned without mercy. Summer pressed down on the plantation like a clenched fist, tightening its grip with every passing day. The cotton grew thick and heavy, the bolls bursting open under the sun, and with them grew the demands placed on the hands who worked the fields. Longer hours, heavier sacks, less patience from the men who measured human worth in pounds harvested per day. Ezekiel felt it in his bones before anyone spoke of it. The air itself seemed sharper, charged with something restless and dangerous. Violence was always present, but now it felt closer to the surface, quicker to erupt, like dry grass waiting for a spark. Thomas Granger became that spark. The overseer's temper worsened as the heat rose. His whip cracked more often, the sound echoing across the fields like gunfire. He no longer pretended discipline served a purpose beyond cruelty. Punishment came swiftly and publicly, meant to remind everyone who held power and how easily it could be used. One morning, before the horn had even finished sounding, Granger dragged a man named Elisha from the quarters. Elijah was broad-shouldered, older, his back already a map of scars from decades of labor. His crime was speaking too slowly when ordered to hurry. They tied him to the whipping post near the edge of the field. Every slave was forced to watch. The sun was barely up, but already it burned. Granger rolled up his sleeves, as if preparing for honest work. "Count," he told Elijah. The whip came down. "1," Elijah said through clenched teeth. Again, 2. By the 10th strike, blood ran freely, soaking into the dirt at Elijah's feet. By the 20th, his voice cracked. By the 30th, he could no longer stand. Granger kept going, until the count was meaningless, until Elijah collapsed in a broken heap. "Let that be a lesson," Granger said, wiping sweat from his brow. Ezekiel stared at the ground, his jaw tight enough to ache. Around him, others did the same. Survival depended on silence. But inside, something twisted, coiling tighter with every lash. Elijah died that night. They buried him beyond the quarters. No marker, no prayer, spoken aloud. Ruth whispered words under her breath, tears streaking down her face. Ezekiel watched the dirt fall. Each shovel of earth another reminder of how cheaply life was spent here. After that, Isaiah found Ezekiel more often. They spoke in fragments, never too long, never in the same place twice. Isaiah taught him how to listen without looking, how to remember paths through the woods, how to notice when something felt wrong. "Pain makes men careless," Isaiah said one night, "but fear makes them predictable." Ezekiel absorbed every word. The plantation had rhythms, like a living thing. Work bells, patrol routes, times when the overseers drank too much, and times when they were sharp and sober. Ezekiel began to map it all in his mind, not knowing exactly why, only knowing it mattered. One evening, as thunder rolled in the distance, Granger came into the quarters unannounced. He carried a lantern and a grin that made Ezekiel's stomach turn. "Looking for someone?" Granger said. The lantern light swept across frightened faces until it stopped on a young woman named Mary. She froze. "You," Granger said. "Come with me." Mary shook her head. "Please." The whip struck her legs, dropping her to her knees. "Get up," Granger said. Ezekiel stepped forward without thinking. Isaiah's hand shot out, gripping his arm hard enough to hurt. A warning. Ezekiel stopped, breath shaking. Mary was dragged out, screaming, the quarters filled with sobs once the sound faded into the night. That was the night, Ezekiel decided. It wasn't a clear plan. Not yet. But something hardened inside him, set like steel, pulled from the fire. He could no longer pretend enduring was enough. Living day to day, waiting to be broken, waiting to be chosen for pain or death, was its own kind of dying. Days later, the whip came for him. Granger accused Ezekiel of working too slowly. It wasn't true. Ezekiel had met his quota, as he always did, but truth had no value here. They tied him to the post. Ruth cried out. Isaiah stared ahead, his expression carved from stone. "Count," Granger said. The first strike stole Ezekiel's breath. Fire exploded across his back. He tasted blood. 1. The whip fell again. By the 5th strike, pain blurred the world. By the 10th, his legs trembled uncontrollably. By the 15th, something inside him detached, watching from a distance as his body suffered. He counted until his voice failed. After that, Granger stopped on his own, bored or tired. Ezekiel collapsed into the dirt. Someone dragged him away. He drifted in and out of consciousness, pain pulsing through him like a second heartbeat. That night, Isaiah sat beside him, cleaning his wounds with water and rags. "You still thinking the same thoughts?" Isaiah asked quietly. Ezekiel nodded weakly. "More than ever." Isaiah leaned back, his eyes on the dark ceiling. "Then it's time you knew some things." Over the following nights, Isaiah told him everything about men who had tried to run, about those who had fought back, about blood spilled not just in punishment, but in resistance. He spoke of vengeance not as madness, but as memory given teeth. "This land remembers," Isaiah said. "Every scream, every grave. Men like them think the earth belongs to them. They're wrong." Ezekiel listened, memorized, endured. The overseer's whip had carved his back, but it had also stripped away the last of his doubt. Pain had clarified something simple and terrible. If blood was the language this place understood, then blood would be spoken. The cotton fields rustled in the night wind, white under the moon, silent witnesses to everything done upon them. And Ezekiel Freeman began to weigh not in fear, but in resolve for the moment when waning would end. Night settled over the plantation with a weight that felt heavier than darkness itself. It wasn't the kind of night that offered rest, but one that sharpened every sound, every thought, every memory that daylight forced into silence. The cotton fields lay still beneath the sky, pale and endless, their calm surface hiding everything they had witnessed. Ezekiel Freeman lay awake on the hard floor of the quarters, his eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. Around him, bodies slept, though sleep was a generous word. It was closer to collapse than rest. Since Lillian disappeared, no one truly slept anymore. Silence had replaced whispers. Fear had replaced hope. He listened to the slow breathing of his mother nearby, uneven but steady. Each breath felt like a fragile promise. Outside, somewhere beyond the fields, dogs barked. The sound carried Esley at night, sharp and deliberate, a reminder that even darkness belonged to someone else. Ezekiel waited. Timing mattered now. Every movement mattered. When the sounds of the quarters settled into a fragile stillness, he rose and slipped outside. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of earth and cotton. The moon was thin, offering little light, and Ezekiel welcomed the shadows. Shadows had become allies. He moved along the edge of the field, careful to avoid open ground, following paths learned through observation and patience. The plantation looked different at night. The big house loomed like a silent judge, its white walls dull under moonlight, its windows dark but watchful. Ezekiel felt its presence even when he turned his back on it. At the tree line, Isaiah waited. He stood still, almost blending into the rough bark behind him. His posture relaxed but alert. Time had etched itself into his face, but his eyes remained sharp, calculating. "You came," Isaiah said quietly. "I always do," Ezekiel replied. One by one, others appeared from the darkness. 7 in total. No greetings, no wasted words. Familiar faces, shaped by loss and endurance. Miriam stood slightly apart, her arms folded tightly, her gaze distant. Grief had hollowed her, but it had also stripped away hesitation. A small fire burned low in the clearing, its glow carefully contained. "Nothing we say here leaves this place," Isaiah began. "Not to friends, not to family, not even to ourselves." Heads nodded. "They took Lillian," Miriam said quietly, "and they expect us to forget." No one answered her. Forgetting was not an option. "They tighten control because they feel it slipping," Ezekiel said. "They don't need reasons. They need reminders. And reminders cost lives," Isaiah replied. "Lives are already being spent," Ezekiel said, just quietly. The fire cracked softly. The woods held their breath. Isaiah studied Ezekiel for a long moment. "You understand the risk," he said. "I understand the cost of doing nothing," Ezekiel answered. They dispersed before dawn, dissolving back into routine, into forced obedience. 2 nights later, smoke rose at the far edge of the plantation. It was not chaos. It was controlled. A storage structure burned slowly, steadily, its loss symbolic. By the time anyone noticed, the damage was done. No one was hurt. But the message traveled faster than flames. By morning, the smell of smoke clung to the air. Overseers spoke in tighter voices. Patrols moved with purpose. Colonel Harrow arrived before midday. He stood before the assembled workers, his expression calm, his voice measured. That calm frightened Ezekiel more than anger ever could. "Order," Harrow said, "is not negotiable." No accusations followed. No names were called. Authority did not need explanations. That afternoon, movement across the plantation slowed. Eyes watched from porches and saddles. Rules tightened. Presence increased. It was not punishment yet. It was a warning. That night, Ezekiel heard quiet, desperate, crying from the quarters. No one went to comfort the sound. Comfort drew attention. The following morning, one place in the field stood empty. No announcement was made. None was needed. Ezekiel worked the cotton in silence, his hands moving automatically while his mind churned. The plants brushed against his arms like pale ghosts. He realized then how much the land resembled the system that fed on it, orderly on the surface, merciless underneath. Miriam found him near the water barrels that evening. "They think pressure will make us fold," she said. "They don't understand what pressure does," Ezekiel replied. Another fire burned days later, smaller than the first, farther from living quarters. Again, no one was harmed. Again, no one claimed responsibility. Control cracked not with noise, but with uncertainty. Isaiah pulled Ezekiel aside that night. "You're pulling the future toward something violent," he said. "I'm pulling it away from silence," Ezekiel answered. Isaiah exhaled, slowly. Once fear moves both ways, there's no balance left. Ezekiel looked out across the fields, pale under moonlight. "There was never balance," he said. The nights grew heavier after that. Patrols increased. Voices lowered. Even the overseers watched the darkness more carefully now. Something invisible had shifted. Authority still ruled, but it no longer felt invincible. The cotton fields stood unchanged, white and endless, hiding every secret beneath their surface. But Ezekiel understood now. That land, like people, absorbed what it was given, and this land had been fed suffering for generations. In the silence of night, among shadows and watchful trees, patience stopped being passive. It became preparation. After the fires, life on the plantation learned a new rhythm, one built not on routine but on a deep-seated caution. Even though days passed without another incident, Nothing felt settled. Every sound seemed to carry farther in the still air. Every movement felt like it was being watched. The waiting itself became a kind of labor, heavy and exhausting, pressing on the mind more than any physical work ever could. Ezekiel felt it most acutely in the mornings. The horn still pierced the pre-dawn quiet, sharp and commanding, but it no longer carried the same sense of certainty. Men and women rose from their quarters with the same practiced motions, but their eyes moved more now, scanning the shadows, reading each other's faces, trying to measure the mood. Even their obedience had become a deliberate act. The cotton fields looked the same, just endless rows stretching beneath the slowly widening sky. But Ezekiel knew better. Change rarely announces itself with a trumpet blast. It gathers quietly, shaping itself just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. Isaiah walked beside him that morning, their sacks already growing heavy on their shoulders. They didn't speak. In the daylight, words were dangerous. Instead, they communicated through glances, through pregnant pauses, through the shared understanding that comes from surviving long enough to recognize the patterns of this place. The overseers were watching more closely now. Their horses moved along the rows with a renewed, almost anxious purpose. Whips were still visible, but they weren't used as freely as before. It seemed that power had learned a degree of restraint, and restraint always meant calculation. By midday, the sun pressed down hard, flattening thought and patience alike. Ezekiel's hands worked automatically, his mind drifting back to the clearing in the woods, to the low fire, to the unspoken agreement that had formed there. No oath had been taken, no promise made, yet something bound them now, something stronger and deeper than fear. That night, the quarters buzzed with a quiet, electric tension. People gathered in small clusters, careful not to attract attention, sharing rumors in hushed fragments. Someone had been sold from a neighboring plantation. Someone else had just vanished entirely. No one knew where they went. No one dared to ask out loud. Ezekiel sat with his mother, listening more than he spoke. Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she mended a torn sleeve, her needle moving slower than it once did. "You've been distant," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Ezekiel hesitated, searching for the right words. "Things are changing." She didn't look up from her work. "They always change," she replied, "just not always for the better." He looked at her, wanting to tell her everything, wanting her to understand the fire that was growing inside him. But he saw the worry etched so deep into her face, the kind of worry that comes from loving someone in a world designed to take them away. "I'll be careful," he said instead. She finally met his eyes, her gaze steady and knowing. Careful doesn't always mean safe. Later, Ezekiel slipped out again, following the familiar path back to the trees. The woods greeted him with cool air and the rich scent of damp earth. Miriam was already there, sitting on a fallen log, staring into the darkness as if daring it to answer her. "You feel it too," she said as he approached. It wasn't a question. "The waiting?" Ezekiel asked. "The way everything feels stretched," she replied, like it could snap at any moment. Isaiah joined them a few moments later, his expression unreadable in the gloom. "Patrols have changed," he said without preamble. "Different rotate. Different timing." "They're adapting," Ezekiel said. "So are we," Miriam shot back. Isaiah studied the ground for a moment before speaking again. "There's talk of moving people soon. Not selling. Relocating. They want to break connections." Ezekiel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "If they separate us, we lose each other." "That's the point," Isaiah said grimly. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy. "We can't wait forever," Miriam said at last. "No," Isaiah agreed. "But we can't rush either." Ezekiel looked out through the trees toward the plantation, its lights faint and distant. Waiting doesn't mean standing still. Over the next days, small acts of resistance began to take shape, each one subtle enough to avoid immediate notice. Tools went missing only to reappear damaged. Schedules faltered. Deliveries slowed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just enough to introduce a nagging uncertainty into their system. Ezekiel watched how the overseers responded, how frustration crept into their movements, how their confidence began to erode. He knew that their control depended on predictability. Without it, Their authority felt thinner, more fragile. Then, one afternoon, a wagon failed to arrive on time. Voices were raised. Orders were repeated, more sharply than necessary. Ezekiel saw Haro himself, watching from a distance, his posture rigid, his gaze cold and calculating. That night, Isaiah called another meeting. This time, more people came. They stood in the clearing beneath a sky crowded with stars, the fire barely aglow at their feet. The faces looked harder now, shaped by days of tension and nights of thought. "We're being measured," Isaiah said. "They want to know how far this goes, and we want to know how far they'll push," Ezekiel replied. Isaiah nodded. "Then we move carefully, purposefully." They spoke of routes, of signals, of the importance of silence. They spoke of trust, and how fragile and essential it was. No grand plans were laid, only understandings. They were building a foundation, not planning a single strike. When they parted, Ezekiel lingered, staring at the dying embers of the fire. "Do you ever regret surviving?" he asked Isaiah quietly. Isaiah considered the question for a long moment. "Some days," he admitted. "But survival gives you choices, even when the choices are terrible." Back in the quarters, sleep came slowly. Ezekiel dreamed of fields without fences, of cotton lefts unpicked, of a silence that felt earned rather than enforced. He woke before dawn, his heart pounding, unsure if the dream was a premonition of hope or a final warning. The days continued, each one stretching patience thinner. Then, one morning, the horn did not sound on time. A ripple of confusion spread through the quarters. Overseers started shouting. Horses moved quickly. Something had gone wrong. Ezekiel stepped outside and felt it immediately, not fear, but a sharp, thrilling anticipation. The entire plantation was holding its breath. Whatever came next, it would not be an accident. The wait-in was finally ending. The morning arrived slowly, as if even the sun hesitated to rise over the plantation. When the horn finally sounded, it didn't carry the same authority it once had. Its echo faded too quickly, swallowed by a silence that lingered. People stepped out of their quarters with caution, eyes alert, movements measured. Routine was still there, but certainty was gone. Ezekiel felt it the moment his feet touched the packed earth of the fields. The cotton stretched out, as it always had, pale and endless. Yet it felt different now, like a stage waiting for something irreversible to happen. The overseers moved with purpose, but not confidence, their voices sharp, their attention divided. They were trying to enforce order, while quietly searching for reassurance. Isaiah worked several rows away. They never exchanged a glance. Yet Ezekiel felt connected to him, as if an unspoken line ran between them beneath the soil. Miriam's presence was harder to pinpoint, but he knew she was there, steady and watchful, carrying her grief-like armor. The morning passed, with little sound beyond the rustle of cotton and the creak of leather. But beneath it all, a tension ran, low and constant. Even the horses seemed restless. By midday, a wagon arrived late, its driver uneasy and rushed. Overseers gathered around it, their conversation sharp and clipped. Ezekiel watched from the corner of his eye as frustration replaced routine. Small disruptions, once ignored, now demanded their full attention. Authority depended on predictability, and predictability was slipping away. That afternoon, everyone was ordered to assemble. They stood in uneven rows near the big house, the building looming over them with its white columns and dark windows. Colonel Haro was there this time, his posture rigid, his expression deliberately calm, a calm that could be more dangerous than anger. A list was produced. Names were read slowly, each one landing heavily in the air. The explanation was delivered in neutral tones: relocation, redistribution of labor, temporary measures. Words chosen carefully to sound reasonable, necessary. Ezekiel heard his name. For a brief moment, the world narrowed. Then it steadied. He had imagined this moment so many times that reality felt almost distant. But hearing it spoken aloud drew a clear line through his life, separating before from after. He searched the crowd until he found his mother. Ruth stood perfectly still, her hands clasped tightly. Their eyes met across the open space. No words were exchanged, but everything passed between them: fear, sorrow, pride. and the painful understanding that some separations were designed never to heal. The assembly ended without ceremony. People drifted away, slowly, stunned into silence. Some cried quietly, some stared at the ground as if memorizing it. That night, the quarters were filled with restrained movement. People packed what little they owned, folding memories into cloth, choosing what could be carried and what would be left behind. Ezekiel sat beside his mother as she folded a worn blanket. "You don't have to be brave for me," she said softly. "I don't know how not to be," he replied. She reached for his hand, her grip firm despite the tremor beneath it. "Whatever happens, remember who you are. They can move your body, but not that." He just nodded, unable to trust his voice. Later, Isaiah found him. "They're moving you south," he said quietly. "Different land. Fewer eyes, harder rules." Ezekiel exhaled slowly. "Then they think this ends with distance." "And it won't," Isaiah said. Miriam joined them, her face calm but resolved. "They believe separation breaks resistance," she said. "They forget that it can sharpen it." They walked to the clearing one final time before dawn. Fewer people came now, but urgency had replaced hesitation. No one needed convincing. The decision had already been made by forces beyond them. Routes were reviewed, signals discussed without flourish. When they parted, there were no goodbyes, only nods, only acknowledgement. As dawn approached, wagons were brought forward. Chains lay visible nearby, not yet used, their presence a clear message. Compliance was expected. Ezekiel stepped forward when his name was called. Before climbing into the wagon, he turned and looked back at the fields. He realized then how much of his life had been shaped by those rows of cotton, not just his labor, but his silence, his endurance, his patience. Places didn't own people. Systems did, and systems only survive as long as people believe they're permanent. The wagon creaked as it began to move. Dust rose from the road. The plantation receded slowly behind him. Ezekiel did not look away. Some lines, once crossed, could never be undone, and as the road stretched forward, uncertain and unforgiving, he understood that waiting was no longer an option. What came next would be chosen, not endured. The wagon moved slowly at first, its wheels grinding against the dirt road, as if reluctant to leave the plantation behind. Dust rose in pale clouds, clinging to our skin and clothes, settling into our hair, into our breath. I sat rigidly among the others whose names had been read. Our boat is packed so close, our silence heavier than any chains could ever be. No one spoke as the gates fell behind us. The plantation shrank in the distance, the big house fading into a pale shape against the morning light. The cotton fields stretched out one last time, endless and indifferent, before finally giving way to trees. I didn't look away until the fields disappeared completely. I felt no relief, only the sharp certainty that nothing ahead would be gentler. The guards rode alongside the wagon, alert and watchful. Their presence was a constant reminder that movement did not mean freedom. I studied the road instead, memorizing the turns, the shadows, every landmark. Waiting had taught me patience. Preparation had taught me attention. The first day passed without incident. Heat pressed down hard, and the wagon stopped only for a little water. We all drank sparingly, knowing that our needs could be used against us. By nightfall, they took us to a temporary holding area an open space bordered by rough fencing. Lanterns burned low. Guards spoke quietly among themselves. Sleep came in fragments. I lay awake, listening to unfamiliar sounds, insects, distant water, the shifting of bodies nearby. I thought of my mother, still on the plantation, waking to another morning without me. The thought tightened my chest, but I forced myself to breathe through it. Emotion was fuel, but only if you could control it. The second day brought rain. The road turned slick, slowing our progress. The wagon struggled through the mud, wheels slipping, the guards getting irritated. I noticed the change immediately. Frustration makes people careless. We stopped near a stand of trees to wait out the worst of it. The guards dismounted, arguing softly about time and distance. One of them moved farther away than the others. Drawn by impatience, I felt the shift ripple through our group. Not fear, it was awareness. I caught Isaiah's eyes. He gave a slight nod, almost too small to see. Nothing would happen yet, but a possibility had revealed itself. That night, the camp was looser, less controlled. The rain had dampened spirits and discipline alike. There were fewer lanterns. The voices held less authority. Miriam moved closer to me as we settled. "The road changes people," she murmured. "It reveals them," I replied. She looked at me carefully. "And what is it revealing about you?" I thought for a moment that I'm not afraid of leaving things behind anymore. The third day broke clear and sharp. The air felt different, heavier, unfamiliar. We were farther south now. The vegetation thickened. The land felt less forgiving. Midday, the wagon slowed again. One of the wheels had cracked under the strain. The guards cursed quietly. Time stretched. I felt my pulse steady instead of racing. This was what preparation felt like, not urgency, but clarity. Isaiah shifted closer. "If this doesn't happen soon," he said softly. "It won't." I nodded. "Not unless the road gives us another opening." The road answered. As they made repairs, one guard moved off the path, impatient. Another turned his back for just a moment, distracted by the broken wheel. The third remained alert, but he was alone. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden movement, no chaos. Only silence, intention, and timing. When the moment passed, the opportunity closed with it. The wheel was fixed. The guards regrouped. The wagon moved on. Miriam exhaled, slowly. "So close. So necessary," I replied. "That means it will come again." That night, we camped near a shallow stream. The guards relaxed just enough to believe they were safe. I watched the water reflect the moonlight, felt the pull of it, not toward escape yet, but toward resolve. I remembered Isaiah's words. Survival gives you choices, even terrible ones. Before dawn, a sound cut through the quiet, distant, indistinct, but wrong. The guards stiffened. One moved to investigate, then another. The third hesitated. Primera did not. I moved quietly, deliberately, guided by everything I had learned in waiting. Others followed, not in panic, but in understanding. Not everyone. Only those who were ready. By the time the guards realized something had changed, the road no longer belonged to them. The wagon stood empty. A few of us slipped into the trees, the darkness closing around us like a held breath, finally released. Branches scratched our skin. Roots caught at our feet. No one stopped. We didn't run blindly. We moved with direction. Toward shadow, toward an uncertainty we had chosen, not one that was assigned to us. Behind us, voices rose, confused and distant. Ahead, the forest waited. The road we left behind would not forgive us. The land ahead offered no promises, but for the first time, I felt the weight on my chest shift, not lift, but change its shape. This was no longer a journey imposed upon us. It was a path we had claimed, and there would be no return. The forest closed behind them without a sound, swallowing the road and everything it represented. Ezekiel moved through the trees with care, every step deliberate, guided more by instinct than by sight. Branches brushed against his arms, and leaves damp with night air clung to his skin. The darkness felt alive, not threatening but watchful, as if the land itself were measuring them. They did not stop until breathing grew heavy and the sounds behind them faded into nothing. Only then did they slow, crouching among thick roots and low brush. No one spoke. Silence was their first protection. Dawn arrived cautiously, light filtering through the dense canopy in thin, broken beams. The forest revealed itself in layers-tangled undergrowth, towering trunks, and the distant murmur of water. It was not empty land. It was occupied by memory. Ezekiel studied the faces around him. Isaiah leaned against a tree, eyes closed but alert. Miriam sat nearby, her posture steady, her gaze fixed forward. Others shifted uneasily, caught between relief and fear. Freedom, even partial, carried its own weight. "We can't stay here long," Isaiah said quietly. "They'll search. They won't know where to start," someone replied. "They always start everywhere," Isaiah answered. They moved again, following the natural flow of the land, rather than forcing a direction. Ezekiel paid attention to the slope, to the vegetation, to the signs of water. The forest taught quickly to those who listened. By midday, they reached a shallow creek. They crossed carefully, erasing what traces they could, letting the water carry away the evidence. The act felt symbolic, though none of them said so. As they rested briefly on the far side, Ezekiel felt something unfamiliar settle in him, not safety, but agency. Every decision mattered now, and that knowledge sharpened his focus. As the day wore on, the forest thickened, heat pressed in, and fatigue followed. Still, they continued, driven by the understanding that distance was their only ally. Near Evening, they found signs of others, subtle, intentional. A bent branch, tied with fiber, stones arranged where they should not be. Isaiah recognized them immediately. "We're not the first," he said. The knowledge changed the air around them. Isolation loosened its grip. They followed the markers cautiously, aware that not all paths welcomed strangers. The forest opened into a hidden clearing just before nightfall. Simple shelters stood there, weathered but maintained. Smoke rose thin and controlled from a small fire. Figures emerged, cautious but composed. No weapons were raised, no greetings offered at first. Assessment came before trust. An older man stepped forward. His hair was gray, his stance firm. "You walked far to find us," he said. "We walked far to leave," Ezekiel replied. The man studied him, then nodded once. That's usually how it starts. They were allowed to stay the night. As darkness settled, Ezekiel sat near the fire, listening to unfamiliar voices speak of hidden routes, of seasons spent avoiding capture, of land that offered cover and sustenance if it was respected. These people had built something fragile but real, carved out of patience and necessity. Miriam listened intently, her face unreadable. Isaiah spoke little, but when he did, others listened. Later, as the fire burned low, Ezekiel looked up through the canopy. Stars appeared in fragments, incomplete but present. It reminded him of everything they had become, broken, scattered, yet still shining. "You think this lasts?" Miriam asked quietly. "It lasts as long as we protect it," Ezekiel replied. "And after that?" Ezekiel considered. "Then it becomes something else." Sleep came in shallow waves, but it came. At dawn, voices carried through the clearing. Someone had returned from scouting. "They're searching," the scout said. "Not close yet, but moving." No panic followed, only motion. Shelters were dismantled quickly. Fires erased, traces softened back into the forest. Before leaving, the older man placed a hand on Ezekiel's shoulder. "The land remembers," he said. "If you listen, it will tell you how to survive." They moved out in small groups, their paths diverging deliberately. As Ezekiel followed Isaiah and Miriam deeper into the trees, he felt the weight of the past settled differently now. It was no longer something dragging behind him. It was something pushing him forward. The plantation felt distant, almost unreal, but the scars it left were present, guiding every choice. The land stretched ahead, unfamiliar and demanding, yet honest in its danger. Here, memory was not buried. It walked with them, and it would shape whatever came next. Morning came without a sound. Faint light cut through the trees, catching the mist as it drifted between the branches. Ezekiel was already awake, his body tuned to a new kind of alertness, one born from caution, not from the crack of a whip. The forest around him breathed a slow, steady rhythm completely indifferent to his fear. They had to move before the sun got too high. Isaiah took the lead, picking paths that twisted and turned. Never straight, never the obvious choice. Miriam was right behind him, her steps so quiet, so deliberate. The others followed, scattered just enough to vanish, if they had to. They weren't just a group of people anymore. They were a moving pattern, designed to be invisible. The forest was a harsh but quick teacher. Ezekiel learned that sound travels differently in the dips of the land. He learned that thick moss could swallow a footprint completely. He started to read the terrain, not as just a place to get through, but as a set of instructions. Survival wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being the best listener. By midday, they heard it. It was distant, but there was no mistaking it. Not voices, not shouts, but the faint, rhythmic sound of organized movement carried on the wind. Methodical. Practiced. Isaiah simply raised a hand, and everyone froze in place. "The search has shape now," he whispered. "They're spreading out." Ezekiel felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. This wasn't just fear. It was an awareness so sharp it felt like a knife's edge. The hunt had begun, not with wild chaos, but with cold, calculated intention. They changed course immediately, heading for lower ground where the woods grew thicker and water gathered in dark pools. The heat was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Sweat poured down their faces, but no one dared to complain. Discomfort was a small price to pay. Capture was forever. As they pressed on, Ezekiel noticed a change in Miriam. She spoke less and watched more. Her focus absolute. Grief used to tie her to the past. But now it was the fuel pushing her forward. "They'll try to funnel us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Push us toward open land." "They always do," Isaiah replied. "Open land makes people visible." "So we stay invisible," Ezekiel said, the words feeling solid and real in his mouth. They reached a marshy swamp, where the ground turned to soft mud, and the air smelled of rot and new life all at once. Insects buzzed in thick clouds. "This will slow them down," Isaiah said, nodding toward the murky water. "Tell you what, head." In stepping carefully where the water would hide their sound and their scent, their progress was slow, but every difficult step was an advantage gained. As the afternoon light began to fade, the forest behind them came alive with distant noises. Faint, irregular sounds, never close enough to be a clear threat, but never far enough away to be ignored. Ezekiel realized then that the hunt was a game of the mind as much as the body. It was about pressure, about doubt, about wearing them down with exhaustion. They only made camp when it was absolutely necessary, choosing spots that offered the best concealment, not comfort. There were no fires. Food was whatever they could find and eat on the move. Conversation faded into silence. That night, Ezekiel lay awake, staring at a small patch of stars through the tangled branches overhead. He thought of the plantation, of its structured cruelty and forced order. This danger felt different. It was honest. It didn't pretend to be for his own good. Before dawn, they were moving again, suddenly changing direction, doubling back over the hardest ground they could find. Isaiah didn't explain his strategy, but Ezekiel trusted him completely. Out here, trust was worth more than any guarantee. Near midday, the voices came again, clearer this time, coordinated shouts echoing through the trees. The search party was closing in, not by luck, but by skill. "They're learning," Miriam said, her jaw tight. "So are we," Ezekiel replied. Isaiah led them into a dense thicket, where huge fallen trees created natural walls. They spread out, breaking the lines of sight, and then they waited. The forest fell silent, tense, and expectant. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Ezekiel focused on the feeling of his own breath, on the rough texture of bark under his fingertips, on the simple act of being completely still. In this moment's stillness was their most powerful action. Finally, the voices shifted, moving away, growing fainter. The hunters were uncertain. There was no cheer of victory, no sigh of relief. Survival wasn't a destination. It was just the act of continuing. When they started moving again, the forest itself felt different. It no longer felt neutral. It felt like it had chosen their side. By evening, they reached higher ground. From a rocky outcrop, Ezekiel could see it, in the far distance open land, fields and roads, a stark reminder of what it meant to be visible. He understood the lesson now. Freedom wasn't found out in the open. It was found in the shadows, in knowing when to remain unseen. As darkness fell once more, Isaiah spoke. "The hunt won't stop," he said quietly. "It will just change." Ezekiel nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "So will. Tamobed on deeper into the unknown, reshaped by every step, every decision." The land wasn't an obstacle anymore. It was an ally. Behind them, the hunt continued, driven by authority and certainty, but ahead of them, uncertainty waited, and for the first time, That uncertainty belonged to them. Ezekiel understood then. The hunt didn't define who they were. Their response did. The forest thinned as the days passed. Not suddenly, but in careful stages, as if the land itself were easing us toward a different truth. Trees stood farther apart now, their roots still tangled beneath the soil but no longer forming walls. The air carried new sounds, the call of distant birds, the rush of open wind, and the subtle suggestion of human presence, just somewhere beyond sight. I felt the change before I saw it. The hunt hadn't ended, but it had shifted. The pressure no longer came from close pursuit. It came from memory. Our rhythm was exhausting but predictable. Move at dawn, rest briefly at midday, and travel again until the sky softened into evening. This predictability had become its own form of safety. Isaiah still led, but leadership now rotated subtly, passed through glances and instinct rather than command. Each of us had learned something the others had not. Survival had become our shared knowledge. Miriam walked beside me more often now. One evening, as we stopped, she asked, "Do you notice how quiet it gets when we stop?" I shook my head. It's never quiet. It's just listening. She nodded. So are we. That night, we reached the edge of land that carried visible scars. Old fence posts leaned at odd angles, half swallowed by weeds. A collapsed structure stood nearby, its roof long gone, its purpose erased by time. Someone had once lived here. Someone had left. Isaiah studied the ruins. This was worked land. He said quietly, "Long ago?" Someone asked. "Why abandon it?" Isaiah's voice was low. "Because land remembers, and sometimes people can't live with what it remembers." We rested there cautiously. No fire, no sound beyond whispers. As I lay awake, staring at the fully visible sky, I felt the weight of the past press closer. Not just the plantation, but everything that came before it, generations, shaped by forced labor, separation, and silence. I realized then that escape doesn't erase history. It carries it forward. Before dawn, we found signs. Not fresh pursuit, not immediate danger, but evidence of passage. A footprint too deliberate to be natural. A mark on wood made by someone who wanted to be understood. Isaiah crouched, tracing it lightly. "Others move through here," he said. "Carefully." "Runaways?" Miriam asked. "Some," Isaiah answered. "Others, just passing through history." We followed the markers slowly, aware that meeting others carried risk as well as hope. By midday, we reached a small settlement hidden by terrain rather than forest dug partially into the earth, camouflaged by time and care. People emerged cautiously, their eyes sharp, their movements controlled. They were older than I expected, some gray-haired, some scarred by years rather than single events. Children watched from behind shelter walls, curious but silent. An older woman stepped forward. Her voice was calm, practiced. "You bring the look of people who have crossed something," she said. "We left," I replied. She smiled faintly. "Leaving is crossing." We were allowed to stay, not as guests, but as observers. Food was shared sparingly. Stories were not offered freely. Trust was earned through stillness, not speech. That evening, I listened as others spoke of routes that no longer existed, of safe places that had become traps, of names remembered only in fragments. This community didn't celebrate freedom. It preserved it quietly, like a fragile inheritance. One man asked me, "You think the hunt stops at borders?" I met his gaze. "No. I think it changes clothes." He nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. Later, Miriam sat beside me, her gaze distant. "I thought leaving would quiet things," she said. "Instead, I hear them more clearly." I knew what she meant. "Ghosts don't fade when you outrun them," I told her. "They follow until you face them." She looked at me. "And then?" I thought for a moment. "Then they teach you." Before dawn, scouts returned with news. Search parties had passed nearby days earlier, not close enough to matter now, but close enough to remind us that distance was temporary. The settlement prepared to move. Shelters were dismantled, paths erased. The children practiced their silence with an ease that broke my heart. I watched and understood. This was not a place. It was a method. Before we parted ways, the older woman approached me. "You carry leadership without naming it," she said. "I carry memory," I replied. She nodded. "Memory is heavier. Be careful how you use it." We parted quietly, our paths diverging once more. Isaiah led us away from the worked land, toward territory less forgiving but also less remembered. As we walked, I felt something settle inside me. The plantation no longer defined the edges of my identity. Neither did escape alone. What shaped me now was responsibility to those walking beside me, and to those who could not. The land stretched ahead, uncertain and demanding. Behind us lay places we could never return to, not because they were unreachable, but because they had already taken too much. As night fell, I looked back only once, not to mourn, but to acknowledge. The ghosts followed, not to haunt me, but to remind me why. Silence was no longer an option. The land opened up gradually, not into a sudden burst of freedom, but into the quiet reality of consequence. Fields began to return, though they were different from the endless cotton rows Ezekiel had once known. These were smaller, broken by patches of woods, shaped by the slow hand of time rather than the iron will of domination. Roads appeared again, thin lines cutting through the landscape, carrying people who didn't know his name and never would. The world had certainly widened, but it hadn't softened. They moved more openly now, not because the danger was gone, but because hiding forever wasn't really living. Isaiah walked with slower, more deliberate steps, his body finally carrying years that no longer needed to outrun anyone. Miriam's gaze remained fixed forward, no longer searching the past for answers it couldn't give. The others had changed too. They weren't lighter, but they were steadier. One evening, they stopped on a small rise that overlooked worked land in the distance. Smoke drifted from chimneys far away, signs of ordinary life continuing, completely unaware of the desperate paths that had crossed right beneath its feet. "This is where we separate," Isaiah said, his voice quiet but firm. No one argued. Endings, especially real ones, rarely announced themselves with a lot of noise. "You'll go north," Isaiah continued, his eyes on Ezekiel. "There are people there who listen. People who remember." "And you?" Ezekiel asked, his voice barely a whisper. Isaiah managed a faint smile. "I'll go where the land still needs watching." They stood together in a comfortable silence, bound not by promises, but by a shared history that ran deeper than words. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations. There was only a profound, unspoken understanding. Miriam stepped closer to Ezekiel. "You carry more than just survival now," she said softly. "Don't let it turn into another kind of chain." "I won't," Ezekiel replied, his voice filled with a newfound resolve. "I know what chains feel like." They parted as the light began to fade, their paths diverging without ceremony, like streams branching off from a river. Ezekiel walked on with those who chose to follow, moving toward an uncertainty that felt earned rather than imposed upon them. Days bled into weeks. They worked where they could, stayed where they were allowed, and moved on the moment stillness started to feel dangerous again. Ezekiel was learning that freedom wasn't a destination you arrived at. It was a constant series of decisions, each one made without asking for permission. At night, he still dreamed of the cotton fields. But now, they no longer trapped him. In his dreams, the rows had an end. The soil was finally allowed to rest, and the silence belonged to no one. One evening, as they camped near a river that reflected the last light of day, someone asked him quietly, "Was it worth it?" Ezekiel looked at the water, then at the vast sky opening up above it, and at the faces around him, faces shaped by endurance rather than ownership. "Yes," he said, the word carrying the weight of their entire journey, because nothing owns us now except what we choose to carry. The river flowed on, indifferent and eternal, carrying memory without judgment. Ezekiel understood then that the past would never just disappear. It would live on in unspoken names, in unseen scars, in stories told carefully so they could never be taken away. But it would not rule him. The cotton fields still existed somewhere out there, still feeding a system of wealth, still hiding history beneath their pale, fluffy surface. But their hold on him was broken. Blood had been spilled there, An immense suffering had been buried deep in that soil, but something else had taken root: to resistance, memory, refusal, and that, Ezekiel knew, would outlive the fields. He stood up, shouldered his pack, and turned toward the darkening horizon, a horizon where no horn would ever call him awake again. The land stretched forward, vast and unknown, and for the very first time, it waited for him to choose where to step next. Thanks for watching. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel.